The book is called White. In a nutshell, it's a story about a young woman who is raised, she grows up in a white supremacist family, and she changes her views when she's quite young. She meets a couple of different people along her path when she's a kid and completely changes her views and decides that she wants to try to fight the movement, such as it is, from within and with sort of dire consequences. So that's essentially the structure of the book. And I'm happy to read, I'll read the first few pages to give you a feel. Chapter 1, December 1994, train line, Montreal to Toronto. There was a knock on the door. You okay? How did she even get here in this cramped toilet on this train with her head between her knees? Wasn't that what you did to get ready for a crash? Put your head down? Or was that only for flying? Her crash and burn already happened. This was the part that came after, and it was way worse. That cop was waiting outside. She looked at the sink and the paper towel dispenser. No sharp edges. Maybe he only got paid for the safe delivery of a live person. It was tempting not to answer and see if he'd bang his way in. I'm fine. Not loud enough. She cleared her throat and said it again, this time too loud. Sarah felt dizzy when she stood up and grabbed the counter. Her greasy-haired reflection made her pull her wool toque down further. Luce had suggested a shower, so Sarah didn't offend anyone who could fuck things up for her. But she hadn't bothered. How much more fucked up could things be? Back at her seat, she sat crunched against the window. She and the cop had only been inches apart since they left her apartment hours ago. Sarah had no idea why he was even there. Something about it being for her own safety, he'd said. Cartell, you sure you're okay? Why did he keep asking? Of course she wasn't fucking okay. She was being accompanied to a loony bin for safekeeping. She'd accomplished nothing in a year and a half of trying. A pile of unfinished assignments and missed exams she'd never bothered begging extensions or making excuses for lay trash behind her at McGill University. Not that the cop knew that part of the story. He'd probably only heard about how upset she was at the police station after Aravinda was attacked. Her fault. Maybe the frequent visits to the toilet had him worried about a urinary tract infection or a drug addiction. I'm fine, like I was 5 minutes ago. Ignoring the sarcasm, he offered her half of his egg salad sandwich, which was kind, but while she was hungry, she was not that hungry. The wife made it. The wife, like wives were all interchangeable. Egg salad made her think of Luce again, who hated it too. And then about how the plan, when Sarah had left Goderich for McGill, had felt clear and controllable. How she hadn't noticed it getting away from her, but Luce had. She waved no thanks at the sandwich. Sarah's hand rested on the poster tube jammed between her thigh and the window, the white supremacy at a glance mural that had taken years of research and still wasn't done. Just finished something. The attendant breathed egg beside her. His eyes were closed, but she could tell he was awake. She wished she could sleep. Not that it helped stop the images. A laughing Aravinda with his worn leather bag of demo flyers banging against his skinny ass, planting kisses on Sarah's cheeks. He was pretty much the only person she let do that, even though it was Montreal and everyone kissed. Then there was his broken body, which she hadn't seen but conjured anyway. It felt like weeks, but it was only days since everything happened. Her eyes rode the power lines over passing fields, gray and brown mostly, the odd red house, blue car, yellow sign. Luce, always covered in flecks of paint, had made Sarah notice color. At Sunnyside Mental Health Center, who named these places? The cop handed an envelope to the woman behind the admissions desk. Sarah wondered what was in it. She'd always been good at keeping to herself. How was there even enough information to justify funding this stay? Good luck to you, then. He squeezed her shoulder. Say hi to your Uncle Carl for me. The cop turned and walked away before she could think of what to say.
Really excited to talk to you, and I have so many questions, but my first is what brought you to this topic, because of course it's not very common to see any book about this, especially from the perspective of somebody who grew up in a family of folks like this. And just, where I'm from, I grew up in the American Deep South, so I'm familiar with folks who think like this, unfortunately?
There's a bunch of things that brought me to this. I did anti-fascist and anti-racist, like street activism in the 1990s, and the book is set in the mid-1990s. That's where the present of the book is in the 1990s. It does go back to her childhood in the 80s as well. So at that time, there was a lot of white supremacist activity, I mean, in the States and in Canada and in Toronto. And we had a group that we had started called the Jewish Feminist Anti-Fascist League, JFAFL, and we were sort of in the street with ARA, which is Anti-Racist Action. They had groups across North America at that time, sort of fighting this kind of stuff. I also had a very close friend who had infiltrated a white supremacist group in Montreal. We had talked about that. So the ideas started percolating. And one of the things that really struck me is the issue of marginalization and who is marginalized in society. Because what ended up happening, whenever there was any media coverage of any kind of demonstration where there were white supremacists and there were anti-fascist activists, it was always like the freaks on both sides was kind of the way that it was portrayed. Almost like a weird flip version of there are good people on both sides, you know? So I was interested in kind of movements on the fringes of society. Sadly, now, white supremacy and white nationalism is no longer on the fringe. Like there's like broad permission for those kinds of beliefs. And under the guise of pride, you know, like everybody else has their pride. There's like queer pride and there's black pride. Why can't we have pride when it's actually on the backs of other people in greater and lesser violent ways? That's how I kind of got to the story.
This is a really small moment, but it stood out to me because it's something that that resonates with me just in my experiences. I can't remember who's talking to the main character about her grandfather. Maybe it's Mona, but they like have a conversation where that person is like, he doesn't really do anything. He's just kind of mad, but like nothing is actually happening. And I find that to be so interesting because I wonder if that's why people kind of frame it like the freaks on both sides, because they're just responding to the anger and fear, like those big emotions or something.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that come to mind. So one of the things I try to not do in the book, sort of to jump to a slightly different topic, is to vilify anyone completely. There's really only one vile, not redeemable character in the book, and that's the grandfather. And you kind of know that from the beginning, even though he doesn't really get anything done. It took me a long time to write this book. And over time, I came to have, I wouldn't say empathy towards those characters, but tried to understand how it is that people end up in the places that they end up with the belief systems that they hold. A lot of it is fear, like feeling like you're somehow denied some kind of legacy that you were entitled to just because you're white, and you've been told by like generations before you that that's what you deserve to be in society. So there's that piece, trying to not just have easy answers like these are the bad guys and these are the good guys and it's that simple. It was interesting because I did a book club a while ago, and one of the people asked me a question about did I think that maybe the white supremacists, you know, whatever you want to call them, all the different groups that they're in, Proud Boys or whatever it happens to be, you know, the ones in Canada that I'm describing, there's a certain buffoonery. They, you know, go to try to do something and, you know, swastika graves and they spill the paint. And my response was that I think in a lot of ways, aside from the fumbling around, I think that for a lot of people, that is where it stays. And it is driven by fear and by anger and by entitled, like, I don't have a job, I don't have anything to do, you guys have it better than me. Like all of those attitudes get wrapped up into, and then you've got a movement that invites you in and makes you feel like it gives you kind of a sense of home. Thankfully, there are still a lot, but there are very few comparatively incidents that end up in like, you know, a huge amount of violence or death. It's a lot of threats, you know, and a lot of spewing of, you know, beliefs and a lot of like marching together to express your anger.
The perspective of the main character, I think, is so special because you see that she cares about people, even though they're saying really hateful things. And I think that that's something that, at least in like popular media, we have a really hard time with. We don't really portray that because it's sort of like, we don't want to condone that awful behavior and like admit that people are worth being cared for when they're being so hateful.
Right.
But of course, like if you're the daughter of somebody who's being hateful, you do love them and care for them.
Sarah is really trapped in a lot of ways. And that's sort of the primary relationship through the book is Sarah and her therapist, Mona, to try to sort this stuff out. She's both trapped because this is her family of origin. And somewhere she believes that it's in her DNA and she is kind of undeserving. Like I sort of in a nutshell describe it, her dilemma as being she doesn't believe that she deserves to live in the world that she's trying to create. She's not the easiest character. She makes some curious choices and decisions and takes a lot of risks. But I think in a way, if you understand her background, she doesn't care enough about herself to not take those risks to try to, reach her desired ends, which in the end, it's like, how much could she actually take down on her own? And that's not what the story's even about. The story's not about how much damage she can do to the white supremacist movement. It's about intergenerational family trauma and friendships across difference. It's true, she does care about people, but she's also very closed in a lot of ways. I think that she's afraid to make deep connections.
I can relate to the character in that, like, I could see having that experience, like growing up in a world where you think one thing is normal and then realizing that it's harming people and it's not normal and figuring out how to contend with that.
I did a gig a few weeks ago and somebody asked me, who's the audience for your book? And I was kind of like, anyone over 18? It was weird. And I was sort of caught off guard for a moment. And I ended up writing sort of a Substack about why it is that it was so important to get BIPOC folks to read the book, to blurb the book, to sort of say to me, oh, Aviva, like, you're good. You've done a good thing. That attitude, which is a very white progressive attitude and desire. And I realized sort of thinking that stuff through while answering this in front of a bunch of people was that, in fact, the audience for the book is white. And my desire is that people look at themselves. So it's not just to say, I'm not a white supremacist, that's over there and this is over here, but rather look at all of the ways in which, we, whether it's like racist attitudes or assumptions or just generally speaking, how we turn a blind eye to a lot of the horror that's going on in the world. And we're just sort of in a way as guilty. But you can feel sort of self-righteous by thinking like, I have all of the right values and those people have all of the wrong values. When I was doing activism many, many years ago, there was this guy that was involved in like the anti-racist action doing stuff. And he had a t-shirt that said, I'm a fag, not a skinhead. And it was like, because he had a leather jacket, like a torn t-shirt, his head was shaved. He looked exactly, and it was sort of fun in the sense that it kind of fucks with your assumptions of what anybody looks like. Like it raises for me issues of passing,
yes.
And who can pass and where can you pass. That comes up in the book too. I mean, Sarah, of course, passes. She does kind of struggle with the fact that she sometimes feels more comfortable amongst those people. But there's only certain people in certain contexts that can pass, whatever that happens to be, whether you pass as straight or you pass as white or you pass as like part of a certain movement. It allows you to move more easily. And some people don't pass at all.
I wonder about the structure of the book because it moves through time, right? It goes back and forth. There's like a central timeline and then like a present day kind of moment that's moving a little bit slower and kind of rehashing the timeline.
There's kind of a present. The book's present is the therapy relationship. Then it goes back briefly to Montreal, and then it goes all the way back to her childhood, and it kind of moves around. And then it follows her childhood through to when she gets to university and the way that everything unravels. And it's funny because when I first started writing the book a million years ago, the entire childhood was done in flashbacks. And somebody had suggested to me, actually an agent, it's like a slightly unfortunate story, but she had said to me, you know what, maybe you should just like pull it all out. Rather than having flashbacks, you should have it essentially chronological and tell the whole story of the so I pull apart all my chapters, and then it no longer works because a flashback is a very different thing from like you're trying to actually tell the story of a childhood and everything that happened. So once it was taken apart, and then people were like, well, can't you just go back to an old version? And I'm like, no, you're not understand. It's not that I don't have the old versions. I didn't delete them all. It's like once you start unraveling something completely, you have to rework it entirely. entirely. In the end, I think that having the reader understand in a fair amount of detail how her childhood was, her relationships with her dad, with her siblings, with Mrs. Broder, the librarian, with Curtis, rather than just little flashes of that. And then she was like, I'm not going to sign you. I don't know what to tell you about the book. When at the beginning she was like, I love this book. I think it probably came out when it needed to come out. I've said before that if this book had been published, like I was already looking for an agent during the Obama administration. So if it had come out at that point, it would have been like, oh, too bad, so sad. Poor Sarah, that was a sad situation. And it coming out right now is so differently painful, like profoundly painful. When you write something over, I mean, I never write another novel that takes me that long to write. I'll just say that. But given that I did, it's been a pretty fascinating experience in terms of the evolution of the book, the evolution of society. Like fiction interacts with the moment, whatever the moment happens to be. And so it's not a static thing. It reconstructs itself depending on the circumstances of the moment. It's a very different book now than it would have been.
I wondered if you wanted to speak more about the publishing process.
So the first book that I published is called Lost and Found in Lymphoma Land. It's self-published. It's a memoir about cancer, which, if I do say so myself, is pretty funny. I mean, it's grueling, but it's funny because it was like my worst nightmare was that kind of a diagnosis, and then I got it. And the rest of the stuff is like first person memoir. I've written a lot of essays. I wrote an essay for like the New York Times had this Motherload blog before, like it's now a parenting blog. And I wrote an article about family nudity that kind of went completely viral for like 20 minutes. It was pretty crazy. Like the way that I got like attacked from all sides, like she's a freak sitting around on her couch naked with her teenage boys. And then other people were like, hello, I'm a nudist from so-and-so. I'm so happy. I'm like, I'm not a nudist. I'm not a freak who sits around naked. But it was very interesting. Anyway, and I wrote about cancer. I wrote about decluttering. I wrote about going a year without shopping. So a whole bunch of different things. So most of the stuff that I have published so far are magazine articles that are sort of first person. That's sort of my comfort zone. I find writing those kinds of stories a lot easier than fiction. It's your story. You know where it starts, you know where it ends, and you know where it, you know, what's happening in it. Fiction, you could be like, you know, Sarah was on the train from Montreal and all of a sudden she was taken by aliens. Like, you know, anything can happen in a novel. It's like, it's such a weird thing. And you have to decide what all of the pieces are. I tried to find an agent for a number of years. It seems that it's not an obviously sellable book. I'm hoping that will actually be proven wrong. I think people did not know whether they could make money off of it. And that's the business of being a literary agent, it seems. You have to be able to know that you're going to make some money selling a book. Somebody suggested that I send it to eBooks, which is the publisher. She's a tiny press in Toronto. And she read it and she loved it. And she said, I'm going to publish it, which was absolutely thrilling for me because I'd had other people sort of say like, you know, some people publish a second novel first and then they come back and they get, you know, maybe you should put this away. And I'm like, I can't put this away. It needs to come to some kind of fruition. Thankfully it did. The whole publishing industry and what the hell goes on and how you do that. And then it's a whole other piece of work. Like you've written this thing. Look, I know because I have like, I don't know how many copies of Lost and Found in Lymphoma Land on my shelf. When I go to events, every now and again, I still get asked to be a speaker at cancer stuff. So I like, you know, I bring a little pile of my book, a handful of people who are like $20. It's frustrating to me that there's so many different things at play at the same time. And it seems that skill, like talent, writing really well, having like, those are not necessarily the things that are like, you're like, well, of course something good is going to happen. This is a good book. And it's like, unfortunately, there are so many other drivers. And then I don't know if you've read the statistics on how many books get published a year. It's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, how does that even happen? Like hundreds of thousands, like tons and tons of new books just like come on the market.
I know. And we only hear about a couple hundred of them, really.
How did you find White?
I have all of these, like I just search through people who follow different people's like writers that I know. Like your book just started popping up on Instagram and I was like, okay, what's this? Of course, I'm like, I really just have to read it. I don't read that many novels. I read more nonfiction than anything else. Like I've read more novels in the last 2 years since starting this podcast than I had ever written in a year. I think this story really needs to be told. And like, if you didn't live that experience, then you can only tell it through fiction, of course.
It feels to me like this was exactly the right fit was fiction for this book. I've thought a lot about the fact that sometimes people are like, but a memoir is grounded in truth. Is it? All I can tell you in my memoir, in any article that's about me, is like all I can know is my own experience, and everything else is speculation. So you have to fictionalize everybody else's experience. The notion that a memoir is true and fiction is not, it's more just a different medium for communicating truths about human nature, truths about trauma, truths about whatever it happens to be. And I think that fiction can do a fantastic job of that.